15 years ago, on the coldest night of the winter, a 9-year-old girl was dragged to the front door of the only home she had ever known and thrown into a blizzard like she meant nothing. She had no coat thick enough for the snow, no gloves, no place to go. The wind was so sharp it felt like broken glass against her face. She stood on the porch, crying, begging through chattering teeth, calling for her father. But her father was not there. He was thousands of miles away on a business trip in another country, and the woman standing in that doorway knew it. The woman did not hesitate. She shoved the child down the front steps, threw a small cloth bag after her, and said the words that would follow that girl for the next 15 years. "Don't ever come back." And then she slammed the door. What that woman did not know was this: some truths do not die in winter. They wait. Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from. And if you love emotional stories like this, subscribe to African Broken Souls for more. The story begins in a quiet town in Vermont called Black Ridge, a place of old money, pine forests, frozen roads, and giant homes set far back behind iron gates. The kind of town where everyone knew who owned the mills, who sat on the hospital board, and whose name opened every door in the county. At the edge of Black Ridge stood the Harlow estate, a stone mansion with wide windows, black gates, and a long, curved driveway lined with bare winter trees. That house belonged to Jonathan Harlow, the owner and rising executive of Northvale Industries, a manufacturing company that had started as a family business and grown into one of the most powerful companies in the region. Jonathan had once been a warm man, not loud, not dramatic, but steady. The kind of father who kissed his daughter on the forehead before work and promised her he would always come back home. His daughter's name was Lena Harlow. Lena was 9 years old the night her life ended the first time. 3 years earlier, her mother Evelyn had died from blood cancer after a long, painful battle that took the light out of the house one hospital visit at a time. Evelyn had been gentle and bright, the sort of woman who remembered birthdays of people who barely knew her, who planted lavender in the spring and read bedtime stories with different voices for every character. When she got sick, Lena stopped asking childish questions too early. When Evelyn died, Lena stopped laughing the way children are supposed to. Jonathan buried his wife and buried a part of himself with her. A year later, he married again. The new wife was named Celeste Harlow. She was polished, beautiful, controlled, and clever in a way that made people trust her before they should. In public, she smiled like sunlight. At charity dinners, she touched Jonathan's arm with concern and spoke softly about family, healing, and second chances. But inside that house, when the guests were gone and Jonathan was away, Celeste looked at Lena like a problem that had not gone away. She did not like the child from the beginning, not because Lena was loud. Lena was not loud. Not because Lena was spoiled. Lena was not spoiled. Celeste hated her because she was evidence. Every room in that house had once belonged to Evelyn's memory. And Lena carried Evelyn in her eyes, in her quietness, in the shape of her smile, in the silver locket around her neck that her mother had clasped there with weak hands during the last month of her life. "Keep this close," Evelyn had whispered from the hospital bed. "So one day, if life gets dark, you remember who you are." Inside that locket was a tiny, faded photo. Evelyn holding Lena in a summer garden, both of them laughing into sunlight. Lena never took it off. Celeste noticed that too. At first, the cruelty came in small forms. It always does. A sharp correction in front of house staff. A dinner invitation withdrawn because children should eat earlier. A birthday present quietly returned. A school recital Jonathan never attended because Celeste forgot to mention it. If Lena left a drawing on the kitchen counter for her father, it disappeared before he came home. If Jonathan brought Lena flowers because they had once been Evelyn's favorite, Celeste would move them to a hallway no one used. If Lena asked simple questions, Celeste answered with cold impatience. "Stop mumbling. Stand straight. Don't stare. Why are you always in the way?" Children learn the weather of a home very fast. Lena learned to walk without sound, to speak only when spoken to read footsteps, to tell the difference between a normal silence and the kind of silence that meant danger was coming. Jonathan noticed pieces of it, but never enough. That was the tragedy of men who loved in broad strokes. He provided. He paid for school. He made sure there was food, heat, doctors, books, security. He assumed that, because the house stood, the child inside it must be safe. And Celeste understood that weakness perfectly. She knew how to cry without tears. She knew how to lean against a doorway and say, "I'm trying so hard with her, Jonathan. She just doesn't accept me." She knew how to turn every bruise on Lena's heart into proof that Celeste was the one being mistreated. And Jonathan, grieving, busy, exhausted, often abroad for company expansion, wanted peace so badly that he mistook silence for peace. The year Lena turned 9, Northvale Industries began negotiating a major international deal. Jonathan spent more time out of the country than at home. He flew to Frankfurt, then Toronto, then Seoul. Phone calls replaced breakfasts. Gifts from airports replaced bedtime stories. Each time he left, Lena smiled and told him she would be fine. Each time Celeste stood behind him with that perfect wife expression and one hand on his suitcase. 1 week before Christmas, the first heavy snow came. The estate looked beautiful from outside. White trees, white roof, white lawn. From inside, it felt like a cold place pretending to be warm. The night it happened, wind screamed against the windows so hard the old glass trembled in its frames. Power flickered twice, but held. The roads had already begun to close. Local weather stations told everyone to stay inside. Jonathan was in Switzerland for meetings and would not be back for 2 more days. Lena was upstairs in her room, reading under a lamp, when Celeste opened the door without knocking. There was something strange about her face that night. Not anger, not irritation, calm. That frightened Lena more than shouting. Celeste stepped inside, wearing a cream sweater and dark slacks, as if this were an ordinary conversation. "Come downstairs," she said. Lena obeyed. In the main sitting room, the fire was burning low. Outside, snow slapped the tall windows in bursts. On the polished table in front of the sofa sat a velvet jewelry box Lena had never seen before. Celeste stood beside it. "Open it," she said. Lena's fingers shook as she lifted the lid. Inside was a diamond bracelet. Not just any bracelet. A family piece Jonathan had once mentioned belonged to his grandmother. Valuable enough that everyone in the house knew it stayed locked in the master suite safe. Lena looked up at once. "I didn't take this." Celeste tilted her head. "Of course you did." "No, I didn't. I've never even seen it before." "You expect me to believe it just walked into your room?" Lena stared, confused. "My room?" Celeste turned and held up a small wool purse. It was Lena's. The bracelet had supposedly been found inside it. For 1 second, Lena forgot to breathe. Celeste stepped closer. "I have defended you for months. Years, really. But stealing from this family? From me? From this house? I will not tolerate that." Tears filled Lena's eyes. "I didn't do it. I swear I didn't, please." Celeste's expression did not change. "Your father has done enough for you." The sentence hit Lena harder than the accusation. Enough for you. As if she were not his daughter, as if she were charity, as if love had already been paid in full. "I want to call my dad," Lena whispered. "No." "Please." "No." Lena took a step back. "He'll believe me." That was the moment Celeste's eyes changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the mask to slip. "He always believed what was easiest," she said softly. "And right now, the easiest thing is for you to disappear." Lena's face crumpled. "What?" Celeste bent down, picked up a small duffel bag from beside the sofa, and tossed it to the floor in front of the child. A sweater, one pair of socks, an old scarf, 2 stale dinner rolls wrapped in napkins. That was all. Lena looked from the bag to the woman, then to the front door, then back again. "No," she whispered. Celeste took her by the arm. At first, Lena thought she would just be pulled toward the hallway and locked in her room. That had happened before. But Celeste kept dragging her, past the stairs, past the coat stand, past the framed family portraits in which Celeste smiled like she belonged there, and Lena stood rigid with her hands folded. The wind could already be heard through the heavy wood of the front door. Lena dug her heels into the marble floor. "Please, please don't do this. I didn't steal it. Please, Celeste, please." Celeste yanked the door open. A blast of icy air hit them both. Snow blew into the entrance hall instantly. For a second, Lena grabbed the side table with both hands. Celeste pried one hand loose, then the other. And then, with terrifying force, she shoved the 9-year-old onto the porch. Lena slipped on the frozen stone and fell hard against one knee. The duffel bag landed beside her. Snow stung her face. She pushed herself up and turned, sobbing. "Please let me in! I'm cold! Please!" Celeste stood in the doorway, untouched by the storm. "You are not my responsibility anymore." "Please, I'll sleep in the kitchen. I'll sleep anywhere. Please don't make me stay outside." Celeste's voice dropped to a hard whisper. "If you come back here, I'll tell your father you ran away after stealing from me, and he will believe it. Do you understand?" Lena shook her head violently, crying too hard to answer. Celeste stepped down one stair, grabbed the child by the shoulders, and shoved her farther into the swirling snow. "Go!" Then she slammed the door. The lock turned, and that sound lived in Lena's bones for years. The child stood there screaming for her father until her voice began to crack. She banged on the door with numb fists. She called for help. She cried for her mother. She promised she would be good. She promised she would never touch anything again. She promised things no child should ever have to promise just to be let back inside a home. No one opened the door. Finally, with snow already gathering in her hair and on her lashes, Lena picked up the little duffel bag and stumbled down the steps. The Harlow estate sat far from the road. 1/2 mile of winding drive, then another stretch before the nearest neighboring property. The storm was so fierce she could barely see ahead of her. But a child locked out of home does not think in plans. She thinks only one thing: keep moving. So Lena walked. The wind pushed against her tiny body. Her shoes filled with slush. Her fingers went burning, then numb. Several times she fell and had to get back up. Each time she clutched the locket around her neck as if it were a hand holding hers back to life. She did not know how long she walked. Snow distorts distance. Fear distorts time. By the time she reached the old county road, her lips were blue and she could no longer feel her feet. She saw one dim light in the distance and turned toward it. It was a small chapel at the edge of Black Ridge Hollow, a simple stone church with a wooden cross out front and one yellow porch light still glowing through the storm. Lena made it to the church steps. Then she collapsed. At dawn, an elderly woman named Martha Green found her there while bringing blankets to the church shelter. Martha was 62, broad-shouldered, practical, and known in the village for saying exactly what she thought. She lived in a small farmhouse with her younger brother, Eli Green, a widowed mechanic who repaired tractors, snowblowers, and anything else people dragged onto his property. Martha saw the child curled near the chapel door, half covered in drifting snow, and she did not waste a second. She wrapped Lena in 2 blankets, carried her inside, and called the town doctor. They learned very little that first day because the girl was in shock. Name, Lena. Age, 9. Parents? At that, the child turned her face away and cried without sound. Martha did not press. Some people rescue with questions. Others rescue with warmth. Martha was the second kind. For the next several days, Lena burned with fever in the small guest room of the Green farmhouse while the storm passed and Christmas lights appeared in town windows as if the world had not nearly ended for one little girl. When she finally woke clear-headed enough to speak, Martha sat beside the bed with soup in her lap and said, "You don't have to tell me everything tonight, but you do have to tell me one true thing. Are you safe if I take you back?" Lena stared at the bowl. Then slowly, she touched the locket at her throat and whispered, "No." That was enough. Back at the estate, Jonathan returned 2 days later. He came home to a house full of rehearsed tragedy. Celeste met him in the foyer with swollen eyes and a shaking voice. She told him Lena had become unstable, angry, impossible. She told him she had caught the girl stealing. Told him Lena screamed hateful things about wanting to leave. Told him that during the storm, while Celeste had been on the phone with security about the missing bracelet, the child had taken a bag and run out of the house. Jonathan went pale. He searched himself at first. Roads, gas stations, sheriff's office, church lots, school parking areas. He called everyone. He hired private search help. He offered reward money. He kept Lena's room untouched for months. But children do disappear. And grief can be manipulated when it is already exhausted. Celeste cried at the right times, suffered at the right times, said, maybe she was too hurt after losing Evelyn. Maybe she thought she didn't belong here. The lie was terrible. The lie was believable. And because Jonathan had not truly seen the depth of what had been happening inside his own home, he did not yet know how to question it. Weeks turned into months, months into years. Eventually, the town folded the story into its list of old sadnesses. People lowered their voices when they said Lena's name. Some said she had probably been taken. Some said she had frozen in the woods. Some said she made it to another state and started over. Jonathan never stopped carrying the guilt. But guilt is not the same thing as truth. And truth, at that point, was living on a small farm outside the village under the care of two people with no legal obligation to love her and every moral instinct to do so. Martha and Eli Green did not replace Lena's parents. They did something more careful than that. They gave her room, a lamp by the bed, warm socks, a mug with hot cocoa, silence when she needed silence, patience when she startled at doors closing, steady voices when nightmares pulled her awake. For the first year, Lena slept with the bedroom light on. For the second year, she kept winter boots beside the bed even in summer. If anyone knocked too sharply, her whole body tensed. If a woman raised her voice, Lena stopped speaking for hours. Martha never said, "You need to get over it." She said, "You're here now." Eli taught Lena how to split wood, change a tire, and listen to the sound of an engine. Martha taught her how to bake bread, how to mend a hem, and how to hold her ground when a room tried to shrink her. When village authorities asked questions, Martha answered what was necessary and shielded what she could. Eventually, through a complicated path of temporary care, documentation, and quiet legal help, Lena remained with the Greens. She kept the last name Harlow in old records, but in her heart, she became something else, too. She became wanted. That changes a person. She grew tall, smart, watchful, beautiful in a quiet, unannounced way that made people look twice after she had already passed them. At school, she excelled. At home, she worked. She read everything she could find about business, law, inheritance, corporations, and governance. Not because she dreamed of revenge, at least that is not what she told herself. But somewhere, deep inside, a part of her wanted language for power, wanted to understand the machinery that had allowed one lie to take her father away while he was still alive. By 18, Lena had earned scholarships. By 22, she had a degree in business strategy and corporate law. By 24, she was consulting for regional firms on restructuring and governance ethics. By 24, she had also learned something else. Pain does not always make you soft. Sometimes it makes you precise. 15 years after the storm, on a gray November morning, Lena was sitting in the village diner reading the business section of the local Sunday paper when she froze. Across half the page was a photograph of a man standing in front of the new North Vale Industries headquarters after a major expansion announcement. The headline read, "Jonathan Harlow named CEO of Blackridge Operations after global return." Lena stared until the letters blurred. Her father was alive, not dead, not gone forever, not lost behind old rumors. Alive. Older, grayer, thinner around the face, but alive. And still in Blackridge. The coffee beside her went cold. Her hands started shaking so hard the waitress asked if she was all right. Lena could not answer. For 15 years, she had imagined 100 versions of this moment. In some, he had died believing the lie. In some, he had forgotten her. In some, he had searched longer. In some, he had remarried again. In some, he was a stranger. In some, he was a ghost. But alive changed everything. Alive meant there was still a door she could knock on. That night, Lena sat alone in her apartment with the newspaper spread across the table. She touched the photograph again and again. Her chest hurt in a place no doctor could have named. Martha, now older and slower but still as clear-eyed as ever, came over after Lena called. They sat together in the kitchen. "You don't owe him a visit," Martha said gently. "I know." You don't owe anyone proof of your survival. I know. Martha looked at the paper. But if you go for your own soul, not because he deserves it. Lena nodded. Then she stood, went to her bedroom, and opened the small cedar box where she kept the only things from before the storm. Inside lay the silver locket, the old hospital note in her mother's handwriting, a pressed white rose petal so fragile it nearly breathed apart, and one photograph of Evelyn, smiling through weakness. Lena lifted the locket and closed it in her palm. I'm going, she whispered. 3 days later, she drove into Black Ridge. Not to the old estate, to North Vale headquarters. The company building stood where an older mill office used to be, rebuilt in stone and glass above the river. Employees in dark coats moved in and out beneath the Silver Company sign. Security cameras watched the entrance. The lobby glowed with polished success. Lena sat in the car for a full minute before stepping out. She wore a charcoal coat, black boots, and her hair pinned back neatly. She looked like a successful professional woman coming to a meeting, not like a daughter walking back into the ruins of a stolen childhood. At the front desk, she said, I'm here to see Jonathan Harlow. Personal matter. The receptionist gave a polite corporate smile. Do you have an appointment? No. I'm sorry, Mr. Harlow is in meetings all afternoon. Lena's fingers closed over the locket beneath her coat. Please tell him, she said, that someone from Evelyn's side of the family is here. That got a reaction. Not from the receptionist. From the older assistant passing by who had heard the name. 10 minutes later, Lena was escorted to the top floor. Jonathan's office was large but spare. Tall windows, walnut desk, framed awards. One photograph of company leadership. Nothing personal except a single old black and white landscape near the shelf. Jonathan stood when she entered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He was older than the man in her memory. Time had folded weariness into him. His shoulders still carried authority, but his eyes carried something else now. Distance, regret, the long erosion of a life that had not healed properly. He looked at Lena with professional caution. Yes, he said. One word, nothing more. He did not know her. Lena felt the child inside her go very still. For years she had imagined the opposite, that he would take one look and know. That blood would recognize blood. That love, even neglected love, would rise on instinct. But he did not know her. She swallowed hard. My name is Lena. Jonathan frowned faintly, confused but not yet struck. She took one step closer. His face did not change. Then, with hands that were steadier than she felt, Lena reached beneath her collar and pulled out the silver locket. It swung once in the office light. Jonathan's breath caught. The color drained from his face so quickly, it was like watching memory physically enter a body. He came around the desk slowly. Not as a CEO, not as a powerful man, as someone walking toward a ghost. His eyes fixed on the locket. His mouth parted, but no sound came out. Then, in a voice so broken it barely survived the air, he said, Evelyn gave that to my daughter. Lena's chin trembled. I know. Jonathan looked up into her face then. Really looked. At the eyes, at the shape of her mouth, at the line of her brow that belonged to a woman he had once loved, and a child he had once lost. His knees nearly gave. Lena? That one word held 15 years of grief. Lena nodded once. Jonathan made a sound no powerful man ever wants witnesses to hear. Half sob, half breath, half the collapse of certainty. He reached for her carefully, as though she might disappear if he moved too fast. When Lena did not step back, he pulled her into his arms. And for a long time, neither of them said anything at all. He held her like a man trying to make up for time with pressure, as if by not letting go he could somehow force the years backward. When he finally stepped away, tears stood in his eyes openly. "I looked for you," he whispered. Lena looked at him for a long moment. "I know you think you did." The words were not cruel. That made them hurt more. Jonathan closed his eyes. "Sit," he said hoarsely. "Please, sit." They sat across from each other with the late afternoon light spreading across the office floor. No assistants, no phones, no interruptions. For the first time in 15 years, Lena told the truth out loud to the man who should have heard it first. She told him about the bracelet planted in her purse, about being dragged through the foyer, about the blizzard, about Celeste threatening her, about the church steps, about Martha Green finding her at dawn, about the nightmares, the panic, the years of believing maybe she had not been worth keeping. Jonathan did not interrupt once. He only listened. At first, his face was disbelief, then horror, then a shame so deep it seemed to physically hollow him. When Lena finished, the room was silent, except for the low hum of the building ventilation and the distant, muted sounds of corporate life continuing outside the office walls, oblivious to the family being rebuilt inside. Jonathan sat with both hands clasped over his mouth. Finally, he whispered, "I left you there." Lena shook her head slowly. "She did that. I should have known." "Yes," Lena said. "You should have." Truth does not become less true because it hurts someone good. Jonathan nodded like a man accepting sentence. "I believed her," he said. "You believed what was easiest." He looked at her sharply then, because she had named the exact weakness at the center of him. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I did." Lena opened the locket and slid it across the desk to him. Inside was the tiny photograph, faded now. Evelyn and little Lena in summer light. Jonathan touched the image with one finger and broke again. "I failed both of you," he whispered. Lena had come prepared for anger, for accusation, for denial, for excuses. She had not come prepared for a man who finally saw himself clearly. And somehow, that was more devastating. Jonathan straightened slowly in his chair. The grief in him hardened into purpose. "Where is she now?" Lena knew who he meant. "At the estate," she said. Jonathan stood at once. "Come with me." The drive to the estate happened in near silence. Jonathan drove himself. No company driver, no security escort. Lena sat in the passenger seat, watching snow begin to fall again in soft, early flakes, as if the season itself had chosen irony. The old house appeared around the curve exactly as she remembered it. Stone walls, iron gates, tall, dark windows. Beautiful from a distance, merciless up close. Celeste was in the front hall when they entered. For one impossible second, she smiled automatically at Jonathan, then saw Lena behind him. Everything in her face stopped. Not fear first, recognition, then fear. Jonathan did not remove his coat. "Tell me," he said, voice low and deadly calm. "What happened to my daughter 15 years ago?" Celeste's eyes flickered to Lena, then back to him. "Jonathan, I don't know what story she has told you, but—" He cut her off. "Don't." She tried again. "She ran away. You remember that. We all—" Jonathan slammed his hand against the foyer table so hard a crystal bowl rattled. "My daughter was 9 years old." The sound echoed through the house. Celeste stepped back. For the first time in her life with him, Jonathan looked at her not as a wife, not as a social partner, not as a source of comfort or calm, but as what she was, a danger that had lived in his house wearing silk. Lena stood quietly near the door, the child in her remembering everything, while the woman in her remained still. Celeste's voice began to crack under pressure. "She's manipulating you. She wants the company, the estate, your money." Jonathan turned to Lena. "Show her." Lena drew the locket from her neck. Celeste stared, but Jonathan shook his head. "Not that. Tell her what I know." So Lena did. No screaming, no revenge speech, no theatrical cruelty. Just fact after fact. The bracelet, the storm, the shove, the threat, the church, the lie. Celeste denied everything at first. Then she shifted to confusion, then outrage, then tears, then half-truths. "She was difficult. She hated me from the start. I was under pressure. I thought she needed discipline. I never meant—" Jonathan's face grew colder with each word. Finally, Lena said the one thing that ended the performance. "I stood outside this house crying for my father while you locked the door." Silence. Celeste looked at Jonathan and realized there was no room left to move in. No manipulation left. No graceful version. No softer angle. The truth had reached him whole. Jonathan took off his wedding ring. He placed it on the foyer table between them. "You will leave this house tonight," he said. Celeste stared at the ring as if it were a severed thing. "Jonathan." "You will leave this house tonight." "After everything I've done for you?" Jonathan let out one bitter laugh devoid of humor. "For me?" He stepped closer, voice shaking with contained fury. "You stole 15 years from my daughter. You buried my first wife's memory. You poisoned my home. You watched a child beg at that door and still sent her into a storm." Celeste began to cry in earnest now. "Please, please don't do this in front of her." Jonathan looked at Lena, then back at Celeste. "It should have been done in front of her 15 years ago." That was the end. He called his attorney from the foyer. He called security after that. Celeste left the Harlow estate before midnight with 2 suitcases, no dignity, and no audience to perform for. Lena watched from the upstairs landing as the car lights disappeared through the gate. The house fell silent. Not haunted this time, just emptied. Jonathan found Lena standing outside what had once been her childhood bedroom. The room had changed. Different wallpaper, different furniture. No traces of the little girl who used to sleep there with a book clutched to her chest and boots beside the bed in winter. "I should burn every room in this house and start over," Jonathan said quietly. Lena looked down the hallway. You can renovate walls. That's the easy part. He nodded because he knew what she meant. Over the next weeks, Blackridge whispered. People always do. The divorce proceedings moved quickly. Jonathan's legal team uncovered years of financial maneuvering, image management, and carefully hidden manipulations by Celeste, though none cut as deep as what had already been revealed. But the private healing mattered more than the public scandal. Jonathan went to see Martha Green himself. He stood on her porch with his hat in his hands like a man arriving at a church after a lifetime of avoiding one. Martha opened the door, took one look at him, and said, "You're late." Jonathan, to his credit, did not defend himself. "I know." Martha let him in anyway. In that farmhouse kitchen, over tea and hard truth, Jonathan thanked the woman who had done what he had failed to do: save his daughter's life. He tried to apologize. The words were inadequate, and he knew it. Martha listened, then said, "If you want forgiveness, earn your way toward it. Don't beg for it like it's owed." Jonathan nodded, and he did the only useful thing left. He started showing up. Not with gifts, not with guilt speeches, not with dramatic promises. With consistency. Breakfast on Sundays. Calls returned when he said he would call. Listening instead of managing. Remembering details. Learning Lena's adult life instead of grieving only the child version of her. He met Eli Green and thanked him too. He visited Evelyn's grave with Lena beside him. He listened to stories of the years he had missed until the missing years stopped being an empty blur and became real chapters in his mind. He learned that Lena loved black coffee, kept meticulous notes, hated sudden loud noises, and still woke up sometimes before dawn in winter. He learned she was brilliant in business, not merely competent, brilliant. She saw structural weaknesses in companies the way other people saw broken windows. She understood risk, leadership, ethics, and human behavior in ways Jonathan himself had taken decades to learn. One snowy evening, 3 months after Celeste left, Jonathan asked Lena to come to Northvale headquarters again. This time she entered through the front doors not as a stranger, but as someone employees had already begun to whisper about with curiosity and respect. Jonathan took her to the executive boardroom. The directors were there, the legal counsel, senior officers, all seated around the polished table. Lena paused in the doorway. Jonathan stood at the head of the room. "I called this meeting," he said, "because 15 years ago, I failed in the most important duty of my life. I will not repeat that failure in business." The room went still. He continued, "My daughter, Lena Harlow, has spent the last several years building a professional record that would command respect under any name. She understands this company's values, risks, and future better than many people already at this table." Several board members shifted. One older man blinked in surprise. Another recognized the strategic reports Lena had consulted on under a different regional firm. Jonathan did not soften. "Effective immediately, I am appointing Lena Harlow as executive successor and acting strategic chief over Blackridge operations, with a board transition plan toward full CEO authority." The room erupted in murmurs. Not outrage. Shock. One director asked cautiously, "Jonathan, are we certain this is not too sudden?" Lena might once have flinched at a room full of power questioning her right to stand in it. Not anymore. She stepped forward herself. "With respect," she said evenly. "Sudden is being thrown into a storm at 9 and learning to survive without the people who should have protected you." This, she glanced around the boardroom, is simply governance. Silence. Then one board member, then another, began to nod. Because competence has a sound when it enters a room. And Lena had it. Jonathan looked at her with something deeper than pride. Not possession, not relief, recognition. At the end of the meeting, papers were signed. Transition protocols began. Staff introductions were made. Lena stood by the boardroom window looking out over the river, while the company that had once helped take her father away now placed its future into her hands. Jonathan walked up beside her. "You don't have to accept it because of me," he said quietly. Lena kept looking out the glass. "I'm not accepting it because of you." He smiled faintly. "Good." She turned then. "I'm accepting it because I should have inherited truth a long time ago. I'll settle for responsibility." Jonathan's eyes filled, but he did not look away this time. "That sounds like your mother." Lena touched the locket. "I know." That spring, the Harlow estate changed. Some rooms were stripped, some were repainted. Some were left empty for a while on purpose. Lena did not move in right away. She kept her own apartment, her own routines, her own life. Healing is not proved by moving back into the site of injury before you are ready. But she did begin to visit often. The front door that had once locked behind her became just a door. That mattered. Jonathan restored Evelyn's garden from old photographs. Lavender, white roses, late summer peonies. He had ignored it for years because looking at it hurt too much. Now he understood that neglect is also a kind of burial. Martha visited in June and stood in the garden with Lena while Jonathan carried tea outside himself. Martha looked around, unimpressed by wealth as always, then said, "Well, at least the house feels less cursed." Lena laughed, really laughed. Jonathan stopped mid-step because the sound was so unfamiliar and so precious that he nearly dropped the tray. Martha noticed. Of course she did. "Don't stand there staring," she told him. "Bring the tea." And for the first time, the house felt like a place where life might stay. As for Celeste, the town lost interest faster than she expected. People who build themselves out of appearances rarely survive the loss of audience. She rented a condo 2 counties away. She tried once or twice to repair her image through carefully placed charity appearances, but the story had spread too far and too quietly. No official scandal could have destroyed her more completely than private truth did. Because the people who had known the Harlows for years started rereading the past in light of what had happened. Missed looks, unasked questions, a child too quiet at dinner, a woman too polished when discussing a missing girl. Some doors never opened for Celeste again. Lena did not pursue her further. She did not need to. Some punishments are heavier when handed over to time. A year after the reunion, North Vale Industries held its annual leadership gala. Jonathan stood at the podium only long enough to say one thing before stepping aside. "For years," he told the room, "I believed leadership meant control. I was wrong. Leadership begins with truth, and truth requires courage. Tonight, I am honored to introduce the future CEO of North Vale Industries, my daughter, Lena Harlow." The applause rose slowly, then fully. Lena walked to the stage in a deep blue gown, the color her mother once loved. The silver locket rested at her throat, visible under the lights. She looked out at a room full of investors, executives, community figures, and employees. People waiting for a polished speech. Instead, she gave them something else. "Success built without truth is only decoration," she said. "I know that personally. I also know something better. A life can be broken in one winter and still be rebuilt. Not because pain disappears, not because the past becomes fair, but because survival, when matched with purpose, becomes power." No one in that room forgot the silence that followed. Not because they were uncomfortable, because they were listening. After the gala, Jonathan found Lena standing alone in the corridor behind the ballroom. "You did well," he said. She smiled slightly. "I know." He laughed softly. Then his face grew serious. "I can never give you those 15 years back." Lena looked at him for a long moment. "No, you can't." He absorbed that. "But," she continued, "you can tell the truth with me for the years that are left." Jonathan nodded. "That I can do." And he did. In time, the story people told in Blackridge changed. It stopped being about a girl who vanished in winter. It became about a woman who returned with grace stronger than revenge. A woman who had every reason to come back bitter, and instead came back clear. A woman who stood before the father who failed her, told him the truth, and gave him one final chance to become the man he should have been all along. Some nights, even years later, Lena still woke before dawn when the wind hit the windows just right. Trauma does not obey promotions. It does not vanish because justice eventually arrives. But now, when she woke, she no longer felt like a child outside a locked door. She would touch the locket, breathe, listen to the quiet, and know the difference between being abandoned and being free. Because 15 years earlier, in a blizzard, a cruel woman had tried to erase a little girl. Instead, she had sent that girl toward the life that would one day bring truth home. And in the end, truth did what winter could not. It survived.